Jake had always loved the quiet charm of his suburban neighborhood. Wide streets lined with neatly trimmed lawns, towering oak trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the comforting rhythm of everyday life. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other, even if they weren't exactly friends. And for Jake, none of it mattered more than the home he shared with Max. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. A sturdy German shepherd with intelligent eyes and an unwavering loyalty. That had carried Jake through some of the toughest times. Whether it was their early morning jogs or late-night porch sits, Max was always by his side. A silent guardian in a world that often felt too unpredictable. But in this seemingly perfect neighborhood, there was one thing that could turn peace into conflict in an instant. The HOA. The Homeowners Association had its fingers in everything. From the color of your mailbox to the length of your grass, they had rules for rules. Jake never minded much. He paid his dues, kept his property neat, and avoided unnecessary attention. But he had also seen what happened when someone got on the wrong side of the HOA. It started small, a fine for a trash can left out too long, a warning about a car parked in the wrong spot. Little reminders that the HOA was always watching. Jake had laughed about it before, shaking his head at the pettiness of it all. After all, he wasn't some troublemaker. He was just a guy who wanted to be left alone with his dog. But some people, especially those in power, didn't like being ignored. And Jake was about to learn that in this neighborhood, staying under the radar was never truly an option. Because when the first letter arrived, folded neatly and placed in his mailbox like a snake waiting to strike, he had no idea that his quiet life was about to turn into a war. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The morning air was crisp as Jake stepped onto his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, Max's leash in the other. The German shepherd sat obediently at his side, his ears perked up as he watched a squirrel dart across the lawn. It was a peaceful start to the day until Jake noticed the white envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox. His gut tightened. HOA notices were rarely good news. He tore it open, scanning the official-looking letter inside. Notice of violation. Dear Mr. Jake Thompson, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of Section 12, subsection B of the Green Ridge Community Regulations. The presence of your canine, registered as Max, does not comply with HOA-approved pet guidelines. You are hereby required to remove the animal from the premises within 14 days or face further action, including fines and legal proceedings. Jake's brows furrowed as he read it again. Remove the animal? His fingers gripped the paper tighter. Max had lived here with him for years. They had never had a single complaint. What the hell was this about? Max let out a low whine, sensing the tension. Jake exhaled sharply and gave him a reassuring pat before storming back inside. He tossed the letter onto the kitchen table and grabbed his laptop. He pulled up the HOA's official rule book, scrolling through pages of dense, legal-sounding jargon. Nothing about Max was a violation, at least nothing that made sense. The rule they cited was vague, something about approved pets in accordance with community standards. No specifics, no history of enforcement. This wasn't about rules. This was about something else. Jake's first thought was to call someone on the HOA board, but he already knew how that would go. They'd deflect, point to policy, insist their hands were tied. No, this needed to be handled in person. Still gripping the notice, he threw on his jacket, clipped Max's leash, and made his way toward the HOA office at the community center. His heartbeat drummed in his ears. If they thought he'd just roll over and accept this, they had another thing coming. Jake pushed open the doors of the community center, his boots echoing across the polished floor. The receptionist barely had time to greet him before he stormed past, straight toward the meeting room where the HOA board held their weekly sessions. Inside, a handful of board members sat around a sleek wooden table sipping coffee and shuffling papers. At the head of the table sat Richard Wallace, the HOA president, a man who carried himself like a king presiding over his tiny suburban kingdom. His graying hair was slicked back, his tie perfectly knotted, and the smug smirk on his face made Jake's blood boil. Richard barely glanced up. "Mr. Thompson," he said, setting his pen down. "What an unexpected surprise." Jake slapped the notice onto the table. "You want to tell me what the hell this is?" The room went quiet. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances, but Richard didn't flinch. He folded his hands, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "It's a violation notice," he said smoothly. "You're keeping an unregistered pet in the community. That's against the rules," Jake scoffed. "Max has lived here for years. No one's ever had a problem before." Richard's smile was polite, but empty. "We recently reviewed our regulations and decided to enforce them more strictly." Jake narrowed his eyes. "And by reviewed, you mean you made up a new rule to target me?" A woman at the table, Nancy, cleared her throat. "We understand this might feel sudden, Mr. Thompson, but the HOA is simply ensuring the neighborhood maintains its high standards." Jake clenched his fists. "High standards?" This was nothing but a power play. He turned back to Richard. "You're not getting rid of my dog," he said, his voice low and firm. Richard sighed dramatically, like a teacher dealing with a stubborn student. "That would be unfortunate. But if you refuse to comply, we have the authority to issue daily fines, escalate this to legal action, and, if necessary, put a lien on your home." Jake felt a slow burn of anger rise in his chest. They weren't just threatening Max. They were threatening his entire life. He took a deep breath, leaning forward. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Because I don't scare easy, and I sure as hell don't back down." Richard's smirk deepened. "Then I suppose we'll see how this plays out." Jake turned on his heel and walked out. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Jake sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him, his laptop screen casting a dull glow in the dimly lit room. The HOA rule book was open in front of him, page after page filled with dense, bureaucratic language designed to confuse homeowners into submission. But Jake had been in law enforcement long enough to know how to spot loopholes, and something about this dog ban didn't add up. For years, the HOA had allowed pets, with only a few standard restrictions: no excessive barking, no aggressive breeds, no off-leash roaming. Max had never broken a single rule. Yet now, out of nowhere, this so-called regulation was being strictly enforced. Jake leaned back, rubbing his temples. Why now? A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Mrs. Jenkins, his elderly neighbor, standing on his porch, her hands clutching a small folded envelope. "I heard what they're doing to you," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder like someone might be watching. "This isn't the first time, Jake." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" She pushed the envelope into his hands. "Open it inside, and be careful who you trust." With that, she turned and hurried back to her house. Jake shut the door, heart pounding, and unfolded the paper. Inside were printed emails, correspondence between Richard Wallace and other HOA members. His eyes scanned the words, each line twisting the knife deeper. "He's been a problem since day one. We need him gone, one way or another. If we push hard enough, he'll either leave or break." Jake clenched his jaw. This wasn't about Max. This was personal. And now, he had proof. The night was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Jake had always been a light sleeper, but something felt off. He rolled over in bed, glancing at the clock. 2:13 a.m. Normally, Max would be on his dog bed near the door, his steady breathing a comforting presence in the darkness. But tonight, silence. A cold unease crept up Jake's spine. "Max?" he called, sitting up. No response. His gut twisted as he threw off the covers and padded into the hallway. The house felt wrong, empty in a way it never had before. He checked the kitchen, the living room, even the bathroom. Nothing. His pulse spiked as he reached for the back door. The lock was still latched, but when he pushed it open, a chill ran through him. The gate to the backyard was wide open. No. No, no, no! Jake ran outside, his bare feet hitting the damp grass. "Max!" he shouted into the night. Nothing. The yard was empty. The street beyond, dark and lifeless. Panic clawed at his chest. Max never ran off. Ever. Someone had opened that gate. Someone had taken him. His first instinct was the HOA. They wanted Max gone. But would they really go this far? Jake rushed back inside, grabbed his phone and dialed the HOA office. It rang endlessly before going to voicemail. He clenched his teeth and tried Richard Wallace's number. Straight to voicemail. Of course. Cowards. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he tore through the neighborhood, calling Max's name, knocking on doors. A few neighbors peeked out, groggy and confused, but no one had seen anything. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on him like an anchor. He collapsed onto his porch, head in his hands. Max was gone. And the worst part? He had no proof. No way to fight back. For the first time since this whole battle started, Jake felt powerless. Jake sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had spent the last 24 hours searching for Max, chasing dead ends and hitting brick walls at every turn. But now, it was time to stop playing defense. His fingers traced over the worn leather of his wallet before pulling it out. Inside, tucked behind old IDs and faded photos, was something he hadn't looked at in a long time. His sheriff's badge. For years, he had served as a deputy sheriff, upholding the law, uncovering deception, and bringing down those who thought they were untouchable. He might not wear the uniform anymore, but the badge still carried weight. And now, it was time to use it. 15 minutes later, Jake pushed through the doors of the local sheriff's office. The smell of burnt coffee and printer ink filled the air as he walked up to the front desk. Behind the counter sat Deputy Mark Gibson, an old friend from the force. His eyes widened in surprise. "Jake? Hell, haven't seen you in a while." Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slapped a copy of the HOA violation notice onto the counter. "I need a favor." Mark picked up the paper, skimming it. His expression darkened. "Damn HOA messing with you?" Jake leaned in. "They took Max, and I know they're covering something up." Mark exhaled sharply. "That's serious. You got any proof?" Jake pulled out the email printouts Mrs. Jenkins had given him. Mark read them, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This is shady as hell. I need access to security footage from around the neighborhood," Jake said. "Traffic cams, home security, anything that might have caught them in the act." Mark hesitated. "That's a big ask." Jake reached into his pocket and set his sheriff's badge on the counter. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a reminder. Mark sighed, rubbing his forehead. "All right, I'll see what I can do." Hours later, Jake sat beside Mark in the dimly lit records room, staring at a grainy, black and white security feed from the previous night. At 2:07 a.m., a dark SUV rolled up near Jake's backyard. Two figures stepped out, both wearing HOA board member jackets. Jake leaned forward, his pulse pounding. They moved quickly, one of them pulling something from his pocket. "Bolt cutters." "Gotcha," Jake muttered under his breath. On screen, the figures snuck through the yard, opened the gate, and led Max away on a leash. Mark cursed. "That's your proof." Jake's jaw clenched. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This was theft. And now, he had the evidence to take them down. The HOA meeting was already underway when Jake pushed through the double doors, his boots echoing across the polished floor. A dozen board members sat in their usual spots, murmuring over financial reports and neighborhood complaints. At the head of the table, Richard Wallace smirked, completely unaware that his reign was about to crumble. Jake didn't wait for permission. He strode straight to the front and slammed a folder of printed security footage screenshots onto the table. The room went silent. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Thompson, this is a private meeting. If you have a concern, you can—" Jake cut him off, his voice sharp. "Oh, I have plenty of concerns, Richard. Like how 2 of your board members were caught on security cameras sneaking into my yard and stealing Max." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time. "That's a serious accusation," he said smoothly. "I hope you have proof." Jake reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his sheriff's badge, and let it gleam under the fluorescent lights. A hushed gasp swept through the board members. "I don't make accusations, Richard. I make arrests." Panic flashed across Richard's face. His fingers twitched against the table as Jake pulled out the security footage printouts and laid them in front of everyone. "Here's your proof," Jake continued. "Clear as day. Your people trespassed on my property, stole my dog, and you," he pointed at Richard, "were behind it." Nancy, one of the older board members, leaned forward, her eyes wide as she scanned the images. "Richard, tell me this isn't true." Richard's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous. We were just enforcing the rules." Jake took a step closer, his voice dangerously calm. "The rules? The same rules you made up to force me out of this neighborhood?" Murmurs of dissent spread through the board. A few members, clearly uneasy, shifted in their seats. Jake didn't stop. "I've already spoken to the sheriff's office. This is criminal trespassing and theft. If Max isn't returned to me in the next hour, I'll make sure you and your little accomplices spend the night in a jail cell." Richard swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. Nancy turned to him, her voice cold. "Is this true, Richard?" Richard stammered, but he knew he was cornered. He shot Jake a venomous glare before gritting his teeth. "Fine. You'll have your damn dog back," Jake smirked. "Checkmate." As he turned to leave, he looked over his shoulder one last time. "Oh, and Richard? I'm also filing an official complaint with the city about the HOA's corruption. I doubt you'll be president much longer." The color drained from Richard's face. Jake stepped outside, inhaling the crisp evening air. Justice had been served. Now it was time to bring Max home. The moment Jake heard the familiar scratching at his front door, his heart nearly stopped. He rushed forward, yanking the door open so fast it nearly flew off the hinges. And there, standing, in the porch light, tail wagging, eyes full of unbreakable trust, was Max. Jake dropped to his knees as Max lunged into his arms, knocking him back slightly. He laughed, the sound raw with relief, as Max buried his face into Jake's chest, his tail thumping wildly. "God, buddy," Jake whispered, running his hands over Max's fur, checking for any injuries. Aside from being a little shaken, he seemed okay. Behind him, Deputy Mark Gibson stood with his arms crossed, watching the reunion. "Found him tied up behind the HOA clubhouse," he said, his voice edged with disgust. "Looks like they were trying to make him disappear before things got worse." Jake clenched his jaw, his hand tightening briefly on Max's scruff. Richard Wallace had crossed a line he never should have. But now, it was over. The next morning, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, but this time, Jake wasn't the one crashing it. Half the neighborhood had shown up. Word had spread fast about Max's abduction, about the corruption Jake had exposed, and about how Richard had used HOA rules to bully and control the community. And people were furious. Richard tried to defend himself, tried to spin the narrative, but it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. His own board members turned against him, distancing themselves as residents demanded his immediate removal. Nancy, the longest-serving board member, stood up, her voice firm. Effective immediately, Richard Wallace is removed as HOA president. A cheer rippled through the crowd. Jake stood in the back, arms crossed, watching Richard's face turn red with humiliation. It wasn't quite as satisfying as throwing him in a jail cell, but it was close. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a real community. People who had once feared the HOA's wrath now spoke freely. The board, newly restructured, promised transparency, and as a final act of goodwill, they abolished the ridiculous pet rule. Jake stood on his porch that evening, watching Max stretch out in the yard, completely free. A few neighbors strolled by, offering nods and waves. Even Mrs. Jenkins stopped, for a moment, smiling warmly. "Told you they'd get what they deserved," she said. Jake chuckled. "Guess you were right," she winked. "I'm always right, dear." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on his porch steps, Max resting his head on Jake's lap. It had been a hell of a fight, but they had won, and as the warm evening breeze carried the sounds of laughter and chatter through the neighborhood, Jake knew one thing for sure. This was home. For both of them. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.